To put it lightly, the California State Legislature is unique in comparison to its 49 other counterparts throughout the nation. But why? Well, for one reason, California's legislative branch is one of only 4 in the United States to function on a full-time basis, along with Michigan, New York, and Pennsylvania. Understanding what makes California unique in its system of governance can help us as advocates to seek impactful and sustainable change. So let's take a minute and just nerd out a bit, looking back at how our system of governance in California came to be. In 1966, incumbent California State Governor Edmund Pat Brown, a Democrat, endorsed Proposition 1A. You see, at this time, California was going gangbusters. Our population was rapidly growing, our infrastructure was tasked, and our overall state budget surpassed $4 billion that year. The argument was that our state's part-time system of legislative governance wasn't enough. In a growing and progressive economy, we would need a full-time set of lawmakers to oversee the state. Hence, Proposition 1A, which would make the state legislature full-time. Now, Prop 1A was anything but partisan. It was also endorsed by the Republican candidate for governor that year, Ronald Reagan. Since that time, we've seen great change in the way California governs itself. We've witnessed 3 iterations of legislative term limits and a state budget that has grown to over $150 billion annually. Our California economy has a gross GDP nearing $3 trillion annually, making the Golden State the 5th largest economy in the world. Now, why am I spending so much time dropping numbers and offering a state civics lesson to you? Well, I'll answer that now. Understanding the system or institutions of governance in our state is essential to understanding how to effect positive change. If we seek to make change or educate our law and decision makers, the impetus is on us to understand the tools of governance that have been given to them. So let's let the rubber hit the road and look at the fundamentals of our state government. Just like our federal government, California has 3 branches: the executive, judicial, and legislative. The executive branch is the governor, who oversees our state agencies, boards, and commissions, and seeks to administer and implement the laws. The governor has oversight or a check over the state legislature in that all bills are signed or vetoed by the governor. The executive also has a check on the judiciary as the governor appoints judges. Governors are allowed to serve 2 4-year terms in California. Now let's briefly switch focus to California's judicial branch. The judicial branch of California administers our multifaceted court system. Now this system has several components, including 3 levels of courts: trial or superior courts, courts of appeal, and the Supreme Court. The state bar is also considered part of the judicial branch, as are the several branch agencies. The California court system serves as a check against legislative and executive powers by making sure those branches do not create laws that are in conflict with the state constitution. The judiciary also is responsible for seeing that laws are justly and equitably applied in all matters brought before the courts. And finally, let's switch our focus to the branch that we're really here to discuss, the legislative branch. Again, just like Congress, the California State Legislature is bicameral, or composed of 2 houses, the State Assembly and the State Senate. The California State Senate is the upper house of the legislature, comprised of 40 members serving 4-year terms. Each member of the State Senate represents approximately 950,000 Californians. Fun fact, California state senators are the only legislative representatives in the nation that represent more people than those of their federal counterparts in the House of Representatives. Given the culture of the Senate and the smaller membership, this House is traditionally less partisan. This brings us to the California State Assembly, which is the lower house of the legislature. The State Assembly is comprised of 80 members, serving 2-year terms. Each member of the Assembly represents approximately 475,000 Californians. Given the fact that there are twice as many members of the Assembly, there are more representative voices to be heard. This leads to a greater representation in spectrum of politics, which makes the body inherently more partisan. Now in California, our legislative districts are not nested, meaning 2 assembly districts do not fit neatly into 1 Senate district despite their proportionate constituencies. Legislative districts are redrawn every 10 years, and it's not uncommon to see oddly configured geographic boundaries or gerrymandering take place. The state legislature also has its checks upon the other two branches of the state government. The legislature can override vetoes of the governor, although not common in practice, the ability is there. The state senate also confirms high-level gubernatorial appointments, which include members of the Supreme Court. Now, I mentioned earlier that we've seen multiple iterations of legislative term limits in California, all of which have been met with mixed reviews and carry their own pros and cons. Now, at this time, a state legislator is limited to 12 years of combined service, meaning you can spend up to 12 years as a state legislator in either house, but no more, even if you change houses from one to another. Term limits have created a heavy reliance upon the body's full-time staff, in addition to advocates such as ourselves, who have become somewhat of the institutional memory. Now let's briefly go back to our high school civics class, as for some of us, it might have been a while since we talked about legislative process. The state legislature meets in 2-year terms. In odd number years, the legislature starts business, which doesn't formally wrap up until the fall of even-numbered years, coinciding with November elections. Bill proposals and great ideas are vetted in the first 2 months of session, and by the end of February, all bills must be introduced. Over 5,000 bills are introduced each legislative session, despite bill limits imposed upon each member. This means that from March until August of each year, committees meet and vet the merits of each policy proposal through hearings. Now, there are 2 types of committees in the state legislature. Policy committees are the ones that we usually think of, with the idea being that policy committees oversee particular areas of public policy and are made up of members, all of whom are considered to be experts in that field. Examples of policy committees could include the Senate Health Committee, the Assembly Judiciary Committee, the Senate Education Committee, or maybe even the Assembly Public Safety Committee. When a bill is sent to, say, Senate Health, the bill is to be examined through the lens of health policy. Other concerns, such as fiscal impact, are not meant to be considered at this time. Now, all bills start with a policy committee and must be heard by a policy committee in both houses. The other type of committee is a fiscal committee. The most common fiscal committee is the Appropriations Committee, which exists in both houses. All bills above a certain fiscal threshold must be heard by fiscal committees, although forecasting fiscal impacts can oftentimes be subjective and open to interpretation and partisanship. So let's bring it all together. A bill starts in its house of origin, let's say the state Senate. The Senate bill is introduced by a senator, is then heard by at least one policy committee, most likely a fiscal committee, and then is sent to the floor for a full vote of all 40 members of the Senate. Should it pass, the bill will then be transmitted to the Assembly, where it will go through the exact same process: a policy committee, a fiscal committee, and then to the floor. Should the Assembly make changes or amendments to the Senate bill, it must then come back to the Senate floor for concurrence on the Assembly amendments. From here, the bill is sent to the governor, who then has 30 days to either sign the bill into law or veto the measure altogether. Now, that was a lot of information, I know. It really does seem quite intimidating, sometimes daunting, especially given the bureaucracy and red tape inherent to the legislative process. However, we got to keep one thing in mind. The process was not designed to be efficient. We don't want to make it any easier to change the law, for if we did, it would make us more susceptible to tyranny. Keeping the process cumbersome slows down changes and creates a more deliberative and thoughtful process, at least in theory. Thanks for watching, and best of luck with your advocacy efforts in Sacramento.